Hello, class. So today I am going to be talking about newspapers. It's our fourth lecture, and newspapers, you may recall, are the second media type to emerge in the so-called New World, the colonies of Great Britain, which are now the United States. First, we'll look at spending versus other media types, both here in the U.S. and internationally. We'll then talk about the history of newspapers. We'll talk about buying newspapers. We'll talk about the industry. We'll do a little thinking about, sorry folks, it's early in the morning. I get up early. We'll talk about the future, as some people project it. And then a few words about the next class, including your homework and reading. So, I don't know if you know where this quote comes from, but it's a song that was written by, I think, my favorite artist in the world, whose name was John Lennon, who was a founder of a group called the Beatles, which I think even folks your age have probably heard of. This is a song called A Day in the Life, which is the last song on the second side of their famous album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which came out in, I want to say, I should have this memorized, but it's 1968. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. It's because John Lennon spent a lot of time reading newspapers, and we used to read the news in newspapers. Some of us still do. These fellas do. A little older demographic, these two gentlemen. I just Googled a shot for an image of people reading newspapers, and this is one that came back that I thought was kind of nice. These two fellows are Israelis reading newspapers. Hebrew, it looks like they both have the same paper. Newspapers are actually pretty popular in Israel. I've spent some time in my work life going back and forth to Israel. I worked with an Israeli company for 2 or 3 years. And a lot of political reporting in newspapers that people can't find other places, so they're pretty popular. Spending. You see newspapers right in the middle of this chart. The blue column is showing 2017 advertising spending in newspapers. And the black or darker column is projection for 2021. And you can see newspaper spending is projected to go down quite a bit. And this, of course, is the story, the tragedy, if you will, for newspapers for the last, well, definitely 20, 30 years. Spending has been going down in newspapers. One of the reasons is that all the classified ads that they used to get, the help wanted ads, the real estate ads, the cars for sale ads have all gone to the web. They used to make a fortune just running those things. But national advertisers, of course, have dropped off quite a bit as well. And when we look at worldwide advertising spending projected for 2021, newspapers are just about even with outdoor advertising at about 6% of overall worldwide advertising spending. And newspapers are popular in other countries. Some of the largest circulation, or the largest circulation worldwide newspapers are outside of the U.S. in other countries, which you'll see a little bit later. This is think it's from your book. I just took the whole page. 2,000 newspapers in the U.S. There were 2,300 in 1970. Newspaper audiences are measured in circulation, the number of people who subscribe or purchase the newspaper at newsstands. Well, the story is right here below, which is the decline in the percentage of adult population that says they read a paper. About 21% claim they do so daily. It was 78% read a paper daily in 1970. And the readership figure is even lower among younger people. 18 to 34-year-olds, only 10% read a paper, and it varies by city. And whenever I ask my class to raise their hands, since teaching, the media class here at FIT, who reads a newspaper every day, it's almost no one in pretty much every class I teach. So this is a traditional media form. It still exists. It will continue to exist in some form, one hopes. But maybe if nothing else in our discussion of newspapers, some of you will become more interested in reading a newspaper. The New York Times is probably, in my opinion, the best paper in the U.S. I read it every day, and I've had students I've introduced to it who now read it every day, seem to like it. So, well, maybe it'll happen to one or two of you. Who knows? So we're kind of entering, just to take a little bit of a step back, we're entering the media type called print. It's based on printing and printing presses. One advantage is staying power. Now, of course, this is where newspapers vary from magazines. Magazines definitely have staying power. People keep them quite a while. I have an ex-wife who has stacks of magazines all over her apartment, I'm sorry to say. For instance, magazines have great color reproduction. Again, this is not the case with newspapers. We'll be talking about magazines next, but newspapers you see down here at the bottom in red are part of the print family, but they're a little different from the rest of print. I like definitions, so as probably most of you know by now. Definition of a newspaper per Merriam-Webster dictionary. Paper that's printed and distributed usually daily or weekly that contains news, articles of opinion, features, and advertising. Yep, that's a newspaper. And we're talking about now the history of newspapers. And when I say history, folks, I'm going to go way back here. We're going to talk about printing because it's print. This is something printed in China over about 1,200 years ago. And it was something that was engraved, and then paper was put over the engraving. The engraving had ink on it, paper was put over it, and it was rolled out, tamped down somehow so that an image was transferred to the paper. But this is not movable. There were also books drawn by hand for many, many years before printing with movable type was invented. Like this gorgeous book, probably in a monastery somewhere. And in fact, monasteries in the Western world were the keepers of knowledge for hundreds and thousands of years. Many of the books, anyway, these many hand printed, were kept in monasteries. Until this gentleman on the left, Gutenberg, invented the printing press with movable type, letters that were separate, that you could move around and create sentences and paragraphs and print your page, and then move the letters around again and print another page. This revolutionized the world. 50 years after he started printing, You can see for this little piece on the left, 500,000 books were in circulation, printed on about 1,000 presses across Europe, the European continent. Basically, it started to take knowledge out of monasteries and castles and disseminate it to the people, the folks, the rest of us. And this was really a revolution in the making. You can see here people reading. This meant there was exchange of information and knowledge. The more people learned how to read. And one of the things this led to was Martin Luther challenging the Catholic Church because he printed up his articles of protest and nailed them to a church door. Middle class is newly empowered, and this led to a valuing of liberty and freedom, and to revolution, really, printing. This I think I showed earlier in the sort of overview of media in the U.S. So in the colonies, a number of, hundreds of years later, a number of printing presses were imported from Britain, and people set up their own printing businesses in different major cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, etc. And they would do printing on behalf of the local government and jobs that people wanted them to do, pamphlets, flyers, posters, things like that. But they also, with the capacity of their printers, would often publish a newspaper. These were 2 pages, both sides of 2 pages. They normally came out once a week. And as I've said before, they had a lot of political content and helped to kind of foment the revolution of the colonies, American colonies, against Great Britain. Relatively expensive. A lot of editorials about the case for the revolution. News from Europe is normally 2 months old because it has to come over by ship. First daily was published, as you see here, in 1783. By 1801, there were 200 newspapers across the country. By the way, another important technological thing for the success of newspapers was the printing of paper. In 1691, there was the first paper mill in the American colonies. Importantly, newspapers have a strong tie to the new government once our Constitution was written. The First Amendment of the Constitution is about freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And it's a press, all right? It's a printing press, freedom of the printing press. The founders of our country felt that it was vitally important that the people who publish newspapers be allowed to say the truth and speak the truth to power and to communicate things that they found out through investigative reporting to the population at large. They felt that this would be a check on our new government, and it was important enough for them to enshrine it in this First Amendment. In New York in 1790, a bunch of papers combined funds to pay, as you can see, for one boat to row out to the ships arriving from Europe. They used to all send their own boats out. It was cheaper to send one boat out. You see here the Herald sent a reporter to cover the Mexican War. There were 63 reporters covering the Civil War.